They planned everything. They picked the restaurant. They picked his date. They just forgot one thing.
There are moments in life that split everything into before and after. Moments where you walk into a room as one version of yourself and walk out as someone completely different. Marcus had one of those moments. It happened on a Tuesday night at a restaurant he had never been to before, sitting across from a woman he had never met, while the people who were supposed to love him most sat in the corner of that same room, holding their phones up, waiting for him to fall apart. They thought they had set the perfect trap. They thought they knew exactly how that night was going to end. They were wrong. And what happened instead would go on to change Marcus's life in ways he is still, to this day, trying to fully process. This is his story, and it starts the way most painful stories do, with family. Marcus was 34 years old when his cousin Todd called him out of nowhere on a random Thursday afternoon. The two of them had grown up together, backyard barbecues, shared holidays, the kind of cousins who spent summers at each other's houses and knew each other's embarrassing childhood stories by heart. But somewhere along the way, their lives had gone in very different directions, and if Marcus is being honest, the relationship had started to feel more like obligation than genuine connection. Still, when Todd called and said he wanted to set Marcus up on a blind date, Marcus's first instinct was not suspicion. It was something closer to tired amusement. He had been single for about 2 years at that point following a long relationship that had ended quietly and without much drama, just two people who had grown apart and finally decided to admit it. His family, particularly the older aunts and cousins, had been making comments about his love life, or lack thereof, for months. So when Todd said he had someone he wanted Marcus to meet, Marcus laughed a little and asked the obvious questions. Who is she? How do you know her? Is this one of those things where you're setting me up with someone you feel sorry for? Todd's answers were vague in that practiced way, the kind of vague that should have told Marcus something. He said she was a woman named Denise, that he had met her through a work connection, that she was nice and interesting, and that Marcus would like her. He said it was going to be a casual dinner, nothing formal, just a chance to meet someone new. Marcus had been burned enough times by blind date setups to approach this one with low expectations, but something about Todd's energy on the phone felt off. There was a brightness to it that seemed almost too eager. Marcus noticed it and then let it go, which is something he would later think about more than once. He asked Todd a few more questions. Where was the restaurant? What kind of food? Should he make a reservation, or was it already handled? And Todd had answers for all of it, clean and quick, the kind of answers that are ready because they have been prepared rather than because they are simple. Marcus noticed that too, in a vague background way, and let that go as well. He agreed to the date. Todd gave him the name of a restaurant, a mid-range Italian place about 20 minutes from Marcus's apartment, and told him Saturday at 7. Marcus said fine. He hung up the phone and went back to whatever he had been doing before the call, not thinking much more about it. This is the part of the story where Marcus will tell you that he genuinely had no idea what was coming. He was not a person who assumed the worst about people, especially people he had known his entire life. He trusted Todd in the careless, automatic way you trust family, not because you have tested the trust and found it solid, but because it has simply never occurred to you to question it. That kind of trust, he would later say, is the most dangerous kind. It is not the trust of naivety exactly. It is the trust of history, of shared memory, of the assumption that someone who has known you since you were both children in the same backyard could not be capable of looking at you and seeing a target. The days between Thursday and Saturday pass the way ordinary days do when something is coming that you do not know about yet. Marcus went to work. He had a phone call with his mother on Friday evening. He went to the gym Saturday morning, came home, did some reading. Around 5 o'clock, he started getting ready for the date, not with particular excitement, but with the mild, dutiful energy of someone doing something reasonable. He picked out clothes that were appropriate without being overdressed: dark jeans, a collared shirt, a jacket. He looked at himself in the mirror and thought, the way you do before a blind date, about the specific uncertainty of meeting a stranger in a context loaded with expectation. He was not nervous exactly. He was simply aware. To understand what happened that night and why it landed the way it did, you have to understand something about who Marcus is, not just as a person in a story, but as a man who had been shaped by a specific set of experiences over 34 years. Marcus grew up in a mid-sized American city, the second of 3 children, In a household that was stable in the material sense, his parents stayed together, the bills got paid, there was always food, but that had its own particular emotional architecture. His father, as Marcus has described him, was a man of profound quiet, not a cold man, not a distant man, but someone whose love expressed itself in presence and action rather than words, who showed up reliably and completely and said very little about any of it. His mother was warmer in the surface sense, more verbally expressive, but also more anxious, more attuned to what the extended family thought, more invested in the performance of everything being fine. Marcus was the child who absorbed both of these things. He got his father's quietness and his mother's awareness, which is a combination that makes for a person who notices a great deal and says very little about most of it. He was not a withdrawn child. He had friends. He was social in that easy, unforced way some people are, but he was also, from a young age, the person in any group who was watching slightly more than he was performing. His teachers had called him thoughtful. His mother had sometimes called him too serious. His cousins, growing up, had called him the quiet one, which was accurate without being the whole picture. The whole picture was someone who felt things deeply and had learned, through a combination of temperament and environment, to process those feelings internally rather than externally. Someone who, when hurt, went very still rather than very loud. This matters because of what came later. Because the people who arranged that Saturday night were counting, in some part, on a particular version of Marcus, on the version that was quiet and serious and perhaps a little socially stiff, the cousin who did not always get the joke, who could be rattled by the right kind of social exposure. They had a theory about him. They had constructed that theory from years of observation filtered through their own assumptions, and they believed in it enough to build an entire evening around it. What they had missed, in building that theory, was everything that was underneath the quietness, the steadiness, the particular kind of dignity that had been growing in Marcus, quietly and without announcement, for 34 years. Before we go any further into what happened that Saturday night, there is something important to understand about Denise, because this story is as much about her as it is about Marcus, maybe more. Denise was 31 years old at the time. She had grown up in a mid-sized city in the South, raised primarily by her grandmother after her mother left when she was young and her father struggled with addiction for most of her childhood. She had put herself through community college, then transferred to a 4-year university on partial scholarship, and by the time this story takes place, she was working as a medical billing specialist at a hospital and taking online classes toward a healthcare administration degree. She was not, by any stretch of imagination, someone who needed anyone's pity or charity. She had built what she had through consistent, unglamorous effort, the kind of effort that does not get celebrated publicly because it happens in ordinary increments, day after day, semester after semester, without drama or announcement. But here is the thing about Denise that the people who set this whole night up either did not know or chose to ignore. She was sharp. Not in the way people sometimes mean when they say that as a compliment that barely conceals a surprise. Sharp in the way that means she read rooms quickly and accurately, that she paid attention to details most people missed, that she had spent a lifetime learning to identify when something around her did not add up. Growing up the way she did, that skill was not a luxury. It was survival. When you are a child in an unstable household, you learn to read atmospheres the way other children learn to read books, out of necessity, because getting it wrong has consequences. Denise had developed that skill young and had never stopped refining it. By the time she was 31, she could walk into almost any social situation and within a few minutes have an accurate sense of what was actually happening underneath what was being performed. She had been connected to this date through a woman at her job named Carla, someone she was friendly with but not particularly close to. Carla had told her she had a cousin's friend who was a really great guy, recently single, and wouldn't it be fun to just go have dinner and meet someone new? Denise had hesitated. She was not big on blind dates, and she had been focused on her classes and her work and building the kind of stable life that she had never had growing up. Romance was not absent from her thinking. She was 31 and had a clear sense of wanting partnership eventually, but she approached it the way she approached most things, carefully and without allowing urgency to override judgment. Carla had been insistent in that friendly, persuasive way that makes it easier to just say yes than to keep saying no. So Denise said yes. She picked out a simple dark dress, did her makeup carefully, and drove herself to the restaurant because she had learned a long time ago to always have her own way home. That detail, the choice to drive herself, tells you a great deal about how Denise moved through the world. What Denise did not know, driving to that restaurant on Saturday evening, was that Carla's connection to this setup was not the innocent, friendly gesture it had been presented as. Carla knew Todd and Renee socially. They had met through a mutual friend group and had been to the same parties and gatherings over the past couple of years. When Todd and Renee had conceived of what they were planning, Carla had been their access point to Denise, the person who could make the invitation seem genuine and harmless. Whether Carla fully understood the intent behind the setup or whether she had been given a softened version of it is something Denise has said she is genuinely uncertain about, even now. What she knows is that Carla connected her to the date, and that the date was not what it was presented as, and that she had trusted someone she should not have fully trusted. She filed that information away, as she did with most things, and moved forward. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Marcus arrived at the restaurant a few minutes early, the way he always did when he was nervous about something, because being early gave him a chance to settle into a space before anyone else arrived. He asked the host for the reservation under Todd's name, was led to a table near the center of the room, and sat down. He ordered water. He looked at the menu without really reading it. He checked his phone twice. The restaurant was not crowded, maybe half full, and there was a low, pleasant hum of conversation around him. It was the kind of Italian place that occupied a comfortable middle ground. Not fancy enough to feel intimidating, but put together enough to feel like a choice rather than a default. Candles on the tables. A wine list that was longer than necessary. The smell of garlic and something sweet underneath it. Under ordinary circumstances, Marcus would have found the place perfectly fine. These were not ordinary circumstances, though he did not know that yet with any certainty. He sat at that table for about 8 minutes before Denise arrived, and he has described those 8 minutes as having a particular quality of stillness that was not quite peace. His mind was doing the thing minds do before a blind date, running through expectations, trying not to have any, failing at that, trying again. He thought about what Todd had said and had not said on the phone. He thought about the vagueness of the answers, the particular readiness of them. He noticed the thought and let it pass. He looked around the restaurant the way you do when you are waiting for someone you have never met, cataloging faces, trying to identify who might be her, ruling people out. He noticed a group of people in a booth toward the far wall, but only briefly, the way your eyes move across a room without landing on anything specific. He did not register them clearly. Not yet. Denise walked in at exactly 7 o'clock. Marcus saw her before she saw him, and his first thought, he has said, was simply that she was pretty in a quiet, genuine way, not the kind of pretty that announces itself loudly, but the kind that becomes more apparent the longer you look. She was wearing a dark dress, her hair pulled back simply, and she was scanning the room with an expression that was composed but alert. Their eyes met, and she walked over, and they introduced themselves and sat down, and for the first few minutes everything was normal. They did the usual first date small talk. Jobs, neighborhoods, how they knew the people who set them up. Denise mentioned Carla from work. Marcus mentioned Todd. They ordered drinks. The conversation had the slightly careful quality of two people who are being polite while also genuinely trying to take measure of each other, which is the natural texture of most first dates and which neither of them seemed to find uncomfortable. And then Marcus happened to glance toward the far side of the restaurant. In a booth near the wall, slightly obscured by the angle of the room, he saw Todd. Todd was sitting with his wife, Renee, and another couple Marcus recognized vaguely, friends of Todd's from his social circle. All four of them were looking in Marcus and Denise's direction. Todd had his phone out. He was not being subtle about it. When Marcus's eyes landed on him, Todd looked away quickly, but not quickly enough, and Marcus saw what was on his face before the mask came back up. It was amusement. Poorly hidden, bright-eyed amusement. The kind that belongs to someone who is watching something they find entertaining. And in the space of about 3 seconds, the entire context of the evening rearranged itself in Marcus's mind. The vague phone answers. The particular restaurant choice. The center table, visible from multiple angles. All of it clicked into place with the quiet, sickening precision of something that was always true and is only now being seen. Marcus sat very still for a moment. He picked up his glass of water and took a slow sip. His face, he has said, went completely flat. Not angry, not wounded, just very quiet in the way that happens when something you were about to trust suddenly reveals itself to be something else entirely. He was doing the internal calculation that people do in moments of unexpected hurt, assessing the damage, identifying what was real, deciding what to do next. He put the glass down. He looked at Denise. And Denise, who had been watching him with those sharp, attentive eyes, said quietly, almost to herself, "So you see them too." Marcus looked at her carefully. He said, "How long have you known?" Denise picked up her own glass, looked down at the table for a moment, and then looked back at him. She said she had suspected something was off the moment she walked in. She told him that the table placement felt strange, too central, too visible from multiple angles in the room. She told him that when she walked past the booth near the wall, she had noticed the woman in it, Renee, though she did not know her name yet, react in a way that was slightly too quick, slightly too deliberate, looking down at the table in that exaggerated way people do when they are trying not to be caught looking at something. She had not been certain, she said, but she had been aware. She had been cataloging small things since she sat down. The way the lighting in the restaurant felt slightly staged from one direction, the way one of the people in that far booth kept angling their body toward Marcus's table while appearing to face elsewhere. She had been building a picture quietly, the way she always did, waiting until she had enough pieces to trust what the picture was showing her. This is the moment Marcus would later describe as the one where everything shifted for him. Because he had been sitting there in the first few minutes of that date feeling the quiet dread of someone who has just realized he has been made the subject of a joke. And what he had been bracing for was the particular loneliness of being humiliated in front of a stranger. What he had not expected was for the stranger to be the only other person in that room who fully understood what was happening. He felt something release in him, some tightly held thing, and he exhaled slowly and said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know about any of this." Denise looked at him steadily and said she believed him. She said she could tell the difference between someone who was in on something and someone who was not, and that he very clearly was not. She said it without performance, without making him feel worse for saying sorry, simply receiving the apology as the true thing it was and setting it aside. She said she also wanted to be clear that she had come on this date because she had thought it was a genuine setup, and that if he wanted to leave she completely understood, and if he wanted to stay she was fine with that too, but that either way she was going to finish her bread because she had not eaten since noon and the bread here was very good. Marcus laughed. It was the first real thing he had felt since sitting down in that restaurant. He told her he wanted to stay. And then, after a brief pause, he told her something else. He told her that he had an idea. He told her quietly, leaning slightly forward across the table, that he thought the best possible response to a room full of people waiting for a show was to refuse to give them one. Not to leave, not to confront, not to perform distress or anger or discomfort. Just to have dinner. A real dinner. The best version of one he was capable of having, given the circumstances. Denise looked at him for a moment with that measuring, precise expression. Then she said, "All right, tell me something true about yourself." And Marcus did. He told her something he rarely told people quickly, something about his childhood, about growing up feeling like the quiet one in a loud family, about how he had always been the person everyone came to with their problems, but that nobody ever quite thought to check on. He said it simply and without self-pity, just as a true thing, and Denise received it the same way. As a true thing, not as a bid for sympathy. She nodded once, slowly, the way she did when she was absorbing something fully. And then she began to talk, and Marcus began to listen, and the restaurant around them continued its ordinary evening while in the booth near the wall, for people held their phones and waited for something that was not going to come. To understand the full weight of what happened in that restaurant, it helps to understand something about Todd beyond his role in the events of that evening. Todd was 37 years old at the time, 3 years older than Marcus, and the two of them had grown up in households that were geographically close enough that their childhood overlap had been constant and significant. They had gone to the same schools for a stretch of years, had the same extended family gatherings, had the kind of shared history that makes adult relationships with family members feel simultaneously more intimate and more complicated than most friendships. Marcus has spoken about Todd with something that is not quite anger and not quite sadness, but exists somewhere in the territory between them. The particular feeling of being betrayed by someone whose betrayal you partly understand, even if you cannot excuse it. Todd had always been the louder of the two. Socially confident, quick with a joke, the kind of person who commanded a room without appearing to try. Growing up, this had made him easy to be around in certain ways. He carried the social energy that Marcus did not generate naturally, and Marcus had sometimes existed in the comfortable slipstream of that, the quiet one whose quietness was less noticeable next to someone who was always filling space. But there was something else in Todd's personality that Marcus had noticed over the years and had never quite named directly. A tendency to use humor as a tool of social positioning, to construct jokes that had targets, to find the thing about a person that could be made to seem slightly ridiculous and aim at it. It was never openly vicious. It was too smooth for that. It was the kind of humor that always had an exit. You're too sensitive. It was just a joke. Can't you take a compliment? But Marcus had felt it directed at him more than once over the years, in ways small enough to dismiss individually and large enough, accumulated, to mean something. The relationship between Marcus and Todd had been declining for a while before that Saturday, though neither of them had said so directly. There had been a dinner a year earlier where Todd had made a comment about Marcus's love life in front of a group of people, something framed as concern that was actually closer to mockery. And Marcus had gone quiet in the way he did, and Todd had laughed and moved on, and the moment had passed without resolution. There had been other moments like it. Moments where Marcus had felt himself being made the subject of something rather than a participant in it, and had not said anything, and had gone home afterward and sat with the feeling alone. The Saturday night in the restaurant was not, in that sense, something that came from nowhere. It was the largest and most visible expression of something that had been building for a long time. Denise grew up, as mentioned, primarily in the care of her grandmother, a woman she has referred to in various tellings as the most important person in her life, and the reason she became who she is. Her grandmother's name was Ruth, and Ruth was the kind of woman who existed in absolute, uncompromising clarity about who she was and what she valued, the kind of person whose presence was so grounded that the people around her could feel it physically, a steadiness that did not waver based on what was happening around it. Ruth had raised 3 children of her own under difficult circumstances and had taken on Denise without complaint or performance, had simply expanded her household and her love to include this granddaughter, and had expected Denise, in return, to work hard and stand straight and never mistake someone else's limitations for the truth about herself. This last piece, never mistake someone else's limitations for the truth about yourself, was something Ruth said to Denise in various forms throughout her childhood, and it had settled into Denise like a foundation stone. It meant that when people underestimated her, she did not absorb that underestimation. It meant that when situations were constructed to make her feel small, she could recognize the construction for what it was, not a revelation about her smallness, but a demonstration of someone else's need to create it. It meant that when she walked into a restaurant on a Saturday night and felt something was wrong, and then understood what was wrong, she did not panic or perform distress. She simply assessed, decided, and moved forward. Ruth had died 2 years before this story takes place, and Denise had grieved her deeply and continued to grieve her in the quiet, ongoing way of someone who has lost the person who was most essentially home. But Ruth had left something permanent behind, and Denise carried it into every room she entered. Denise had been in 2 significant relationships before this point in her life. The first had ended in her mid-20s when she had been with someone who was charming on the surface and increasingly controlling underneath. A slow, gradual revelation that had taken longer than she would have liked to name clearly, because the signs had been subtle and she had trusted the relationship more than the signals. The second had been healthier and had ended not from conflict, but from an honest acknowledgement that they wanted different things, a conversation that had been difficult but clean. Both experiences had added to her understanding of herself and what she needed. She knew, at 31, that she valued honesty above almost every other quality, that she could not sustain relationships built on performance or pretense, and that her instincts about people were reliable enough to be trusted even when trusting them was inconvenient. All of this is relevant to what happened at that restaurant table. Because Denise did not respond to Marcus the way she did, because she was being polite or because she was trying to turn a bad situation into a good story. She responded to him the way she did because she read him accurately and quickly and found that what she read was someone worth responding to genuinely. And that assessment, made under objectively strange and uncomfortable circumstances, made in real time without the luxury of reflection, would prove to be one of the most significant accurate reads of her adult life. The dinner itself lasted nearly 2.5 hours. Marcus and Denise ordered appetizers, then entrees, then sat with coffee and dessert long after most of the other tables around them had turned over. They talked about their work. Denise explained the particular frustrations of medical billing with such dry, precise humor that Marcus found himself laughing hard enough that a couple at the next table glanced over smiling. She described the specific experience of being on the phone with an insurance company representative who clearly also knew the policy was wrong, but was not permitted to admit it, and she did it with such exact, deadpan detail that it became something between a comedy routine and a philosophical statement about systems and the people caught inside them. Marcus was genuinely delighted by it. He had not expected to be delighted by anything that evening, and the feeling was vivid and real. Marcus talked about his job as a project manager at a mid-sized construction firm, the way large projects had rhythms and personalities of their own, the satisfaction of watching something become real that had started as just a plan on paper. He talked about the specific pleasure of a project coming in on timeline, which he acknowledged was not the most exciting thing to be passionate about, but which he felt genuinely enthusiastic about in a way he had learned not to apologize for. Denise asked him real questions about it. Not polite, surface-level questions, but the kind that suggested she was actually curious, that she was building a picture. She asked what it felt like when something went wrong on a large scale, when a project that had been on track suddenly wasn't. He told her honestly that it felt like the floor dropping, briefly, and then like a problem to solve, and that the transition between those two feelings had gotten faster over the years. She nodded and said that was exactly how she would have guessed he would describe it. He asked her how she would have guessed that. She said because he seemed like someone who had learned to move from feeling to function without losing either one. It was the most accurately he had been described by a stranger in as long as he could remember. He sat with that for a moment and then said thank you, and she accepted the thank you without deflection. They talked about books. She was reading a biography of a historical figure she had become fascinated with, and he had opinions about biography as a form that led them into a conversation about the relationship between public life and private truth that went longer than either of them expected. They talked about travel, places they had both been to, and what those places had actually felt like versus what they had expected, and places they both wanted to go. He wanted to go to Portugal. She had been thinking about Japan. They discussed the particular American experience of traveling internationally and trying to hold your cultural assumptions loosely enough to actually see where you are. They talked about music with the earnest specificity of two people who care about it more than they typically admit in casual conversation. They talked about food, regional food, specifically, the way certain dishes are attached to certain memories, the way her grandmother's cooking existed in her memory not just as flavor, but as an entire emotional landscape. Somewhere in the middle of all this, Denise said something that Marcus has repeated in the telling of this story more than almost anything else. She was talking about the idea of dignity, about how she had grown up without a lot of material things, but had been raised by a grandmother who had an absolute, an unshakable sense of her own dignity, and who had passed that sense directly to Denise. She said, "There are people who think they can diminish you by putting you in a small situation. But a small situation can't make you small unless you let it." She was not saying it directly about what was happening in that restaurant. She did not need to. Marcus looked at her across the table and understood that this woman had spent her whole life refusing to be made small by people who underestimated her, and that she was doing it again right now, with complete calm, in real time. And he understood something else, that the people in the booth near the wall had picked her for their setup in the belief that she was someone whose presence would embarrass him. They had gotten her exactly wrong. Over in the booth near the wall, the energy had changed noticeably by the midpoint of the meal. Todd had put his phone down at some point. The conversation among the four of them had lost its earlier brightness. Renee had gone quiet in the particular way of someone who was recalculating. The other couple with them had stopped looking over at Marcus's table with the same frequency they had earlier in the evening. The joke, whatever it had been intended to be, had failed to land in the way jokes do when the person they are aimed at simply does not react the expected way. And now the four of them were left sitting in a restaurant booth they had specifically come to and were paying for, watching two people have what appeared by every observable measure to be a genuinely good time, with no clear path to the evening they had planned. It was Renee who cracked first, which Marcus says did not surprise him particularly, because Renee had always been the more impulsive of the two. She was Todd's wife of 6 years, a woman with a gift for social performance and a need to be at the center of whatever was happening around her. The two of them had never had an openly hostile relationship, but there had always been a current of something between them. Renee's implication, never quite stated directly, that Marcus was too serious, too closed off, not the right kind of fun. Marcus had always suspected that a meaningful portion of Todd's more pointed observations about his life had originated with Renee, refined and handed back to Todd to deliver. What you have to understand about Renee in this moment is that she had arrived at that restaurant with a very clear sense of how the evening was going to go. She and Todd and their friends had planned to watch Marcus arrive, watch his face when he met Denise, capture whatever reaction they got on video, and then spend the rest of the evening with the comfortable superiority of people who have successfully executed a social maneuver. The fact that none of this had materialized, that Marcus had sat down and appeared almost immediately at ease, that the date had turned visibly real and warm, that there was nothing to film that served the purpose she had come there to film, had produced in Renee a frustration she was not good at managing quietly. She needed something to happen. She needed to make something happen. And so she got up from the booth and walked across the restaurant toward Marcus's table. She did it with the particular energy of someone who has been sitting still too long while something is not going the way they wanted. She walked up to the table and looked at Marcus and Denise and said, with a smile that was doing a lot of work, "Oh my God, is that you, Marcus? What are you doing here?" The performance of surprise was so transparent that Denise later told Marcus it was almost impressive in its commitment. That performing that level of false astonishment in front of two people who both knew it was false required a specific kind of social fearlessness, or possibly a specific kind of blind spot. Marcus looked up at Renee. He kept his face entirely neutral. He said, "Hey, Renee." That was all. 2 words. No performance of surprise in return, no playing along, no anger, no warmth. Just her name, acknowledged, nothing more. There was a beat of silence in which Renee's smile worked harder and produced less. The smile was the kind that requires cooperation from its audience, and was receiving none. She looked at Denise and said, "And who is this?" in a tone that was meant to be breezy and landed somewhere else entirely. Denise looked at Renee with the calm, measuring expression that was, Marcus was already learning, one of her defaults, and she said her name clearly and without elaboration and did not ask Renee's name in return. Not out of rudeness, but out of the precise economy of someone who was not going to perform warmth she did not feel. The social contract that Renee was attempting to invoke, the one that says when someone introduces themselves you introduce yourself back and ask questions and create the warm buzz of exchange, Denise declined to sign. She said her name and looked at Renee and waited. Renee stood there for a moment holding the weight of an interaction she had initiated and was no longer controlling. She made one more attempt, something like, "It's so funny running into you. Todd is over there. You should come say hi." And Marcus said, "I'll come find him on the way out," in a tone that made perfectly clear he would not, and that the conversation was over. He did not say it unkindly. He said it with the same flat calm he had been maintaining since he saw Todd's face across the restaurant. Precise and closed, a door that was politely but unambiguously shut. Renee looked at him for one more second, and in that second something passed across her face that was more honest than anything she had shown all evening. Then the smile came back. She said something like, "Okay, well, it was great to see you," and she walked back to the booth. Denise watched her go, and then turned back to Marcus and said nothing at all, which was exactly right. They finished their coffee. When Marcus and Denise finally stood to leave, Marcus paid the check. He had insisted when it came, and Denise had not put up a performative protest. simply said thank you in the direct way of someone who appreciated the gesture without making a production of it. They gathered their things, and Marcus held Denise's coat in that old-fashioned instinctive way some men do. And she accepted it in the equally old-fashioned way of someone who neither needs the gesture nor sees any reason to refuse it. There was a naturalness to the sequence of small physical courtesies that passed between them as they prepared to leave that neither of them commented on. It was just there, easy and unannounced, the way ease sometimes arrives between people who have somehow already established something. As they walked toward the exit, Marcus's path took them naturally past the booth near the wall. He did not alter his route to avoid it, and he did not slow down or angle toward it. He walked at his normal pace, and as they passed, he glanced over at Todd, not at the whole group, specifically at Todd, and nodded once. A single, calm nod. Not a greeting, not a gesture of closure, not anything that invited response. The nod of someone who sees you clearly and has decided that clarity is the only acknowledgement you are going to get. Todd opened his mouth and Marcus had already looked forward again. He and Denise walked out of the restaurant into the night air, and the door swung, closed behind them. Marcus has described the feeling of standing on that sidewalk as one of the clearest moments of his adult life. Not triumphant exactly, because triumph suggests the other side had power to defeat, and he had decided somewhere during that dinner that they had not had as much as they thought. Not relieved exactly, because relief implies the threat was real enough to have genuinely endangered something, and he had found, sitting across from Denise for 2.5 hours, that what they had tried to threaten was more solid than any of them had accounted for. What he felt, standing outside that restaurant, was something closer to clarity. Like something unnecessary had been removed, and what was left was exactly what was real. Denise stood beside him and said she had parked on the next block. He offered to walk with her. She said sure. They walked 1.5 blocks in the kind of quiet that is comfortable rather than empty, and when they got to her car she turned and said she had genuinely had a good time, which she had not expected given the circumstances. Marcus said the same. He asked if she would want to do it again sometime. A real date, arranged by themselves, no intermediaries. Denise looked at him for a moment and then said yes. Marcus drove home that night in a state he has described as something between calm and unsettled, not the distress he might have expected to feel, but also not the simple contentment of a good evening. His mind was moving through everything that had happened with the methodical, non-reactive quality that was his natural processing mode, laying things out and examining them in order. He thought about Todd's face in the booth. He thought about Renee walking across the restaurant with that performed surprise. He thought about the other couple there, people he barely knew who had come specifically to observe his humiliation and had sat there for 2 hours watching something else instead. He thought about the phone Todd had been holding. He thought about what was on that phone, what footage, what text messages planning the evening, what conversation in some group chat he was not part of, what version of himself existed in that chat as the subject of a joke. He thought, most persistently, about what the joke was supposed to be. He had been turning this over since the moment he understood what was happening, and the conclusion he kept arriving at was the one that was most uncomfortable. They had picked Denise because they believed her presence would be embarrassing to him. Not because of anything she had done, not because of any conflict or history, simply because of what they perceived when they looked at her. And this meant that the joke required 2 targets. Marcus, who was supposed to be humiliated by being presented with someone they considered beneath his expectations, and Denise, who was supposed to serve as the instrument of that humiliation without knowing she was being used. Both things had failed, but the fact that they had been attempted, the fact that someone had looked at Denise and thought, she will work for this, sat in Marcus's chest in a place that was past personal. He got home, changed out of his clothes, sat on his couch in the quiet of his apartment. He did not call anyone. He did not send any messages. He sat with everything and let it be what it was. This was characteristic of him, the long pause before the response, the refusal to act before he understood clearly what he wanted to do and why. He knew he would have to talk to Todd. He knew that conversation was coming and that it was not going to be simple or comfortable. But he also knew he was not ready for it yet, and that doing it before he was ready would produce a version of it that was about emotion rather than truth, and he wanted truth. He wanted to say exactly what he meant and nothing that was just anger looking for a place to land. So he waited. Marcus called Todd on Monday evening, 2 days after the restaurant. He had spent Sunday doing ordinary things with the events sitting in the background of his mind, settling, being understood. By Monday evening, he knew what he wanted to say and how he wanted to say it. He made the call from his apartment, sitting at his kitchen table, the way he preferred to have difficult conversations, somewhere grounded, somewhere quiet, with nothing else demanding his attention. Todd answered on the third ring with a casual "Hey, man," that told Marcus immediately that Todd had decided the whole thing was going to be treated as a light-hearted misunderstanding, something they could chuckle about, that Marcus would eventually come around on, that would fade back into the fabric of their relationship without leaving a permanent mark. This was, Marcus recognized, how Todd handled most things that required accountability. He made them smaller retroactively. He wrapped them in jokes and casualness until they shrank to a size that was easy to dismiss. It was a practice skill that had probably served Todd well in many contexts, and it was not going to work here. Marcus let Todd get through exactly one sentence of casual preamble and then said, quietly and without room for interruption, that he needed Todd to listen for a few minutes. Todd went quiet. Marcus spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not use language that was emotional or accusatory. He laid out what he knew and what he had understood: the planning, the table placement, the phone, the booth, all four of them there specifically to observe and record. He acknowledged that Todd might frame this as a harmless joke that Marcus was taking too seriously, and he said he wanted to address that directly, that the measure of whether something is harmless is not determined by the person who did it, but by the person it was done to, and that on that measure this was not harmless. Then he said the part about Denise. He said that was the part he could not move past. He said that Denise was a person who had come to that restaurant in good faith because someone she trusted had told her it was genuine, and that she had been used, without her knowledge, as a component of something designed to cause Marcus discomfort. He said that Denise had handled the entire evening with more dignity and grace than anyone else in that restaurant, and that the fact that Todd and Renee had chosen her for this role, the fact that looking at her they had seen a suitable prop, told Marcus something he needed to know about how they saw people. Todd tried to speak twice during this. Marcus waited both times and then continued. When he was finished, he stopped talking and waited. Todd was quiet for a moment and then said it was just meant to be funny, that Marcus was making it into something it wasn't, that Denise had seemed totally fine. Marcus said he was done with the call. He said it without anger, without drama. He said it as a statement of fact. And he hung up. What Marcus had not fully anticipated, though in retrospect he would say he should have, was the speed and thoroughness with which the story would move through the extended family network. Families have their own communication infrastructure, informal and remarkably efficient, and within less than a week a version of the Saturday night events had reached enough people that Marcus started receiving calls. Not from people checking on him or asking how he was. From people trying to stabilize the situation, to smooth it back into a shape that was comfortable, to restore the social surface that had been disrupted. His Aunt Linda called first. Linda was Todd's mother, a woman Marcus had known his entire life as warm and genuinely loving in her better moments and deeply invested in her son's good standing in all moments. She called with a tone that was performing apology while actually being something else, something that wanted Marcus to agree that the whole thing had been minor, that Todd had not meant harm, that families went through these things and came out the other side. Marcus was patient with his aunt. He told her he understood she was calling out of love for her son and for the family, and he did not hold that against her. He told her he was not interested in making this a prolonged conflict. He told her, gently but plainly, that what bothered him most was not what had been done to him. He could absorb that, but what had been done to Denise, who had no stake in any family history and who had been used without her knowledge or consent. Linda was quiet for a moment and then said she hadn't thought about it from that angle. Marcus said he knew. He said that was part of what he was trying to say. The calls that came after Linda's were less generous in their framing. A cousin called to report that Renee had been telling people Marcus was being cold and difficult and had overreacted to something that was obviously a joke. Another relative, an older one who had always prided himself on being the family peacemaker, called to suggest that Marcus consider reaching out to Todd to smooth things over, that holding grudges was hard on the holder, that family was family. Marcus listened to all of these calls with the same patient, flat attention. He did not argue. He did not defend himself against the charge of overreacting. He did not perform the reconciliation that people were angling toward. He said what he thought clearly when asked and said nothing more. He noticed that not one of these calls included any acknowledgement of what had been done to Denise. He noticed that in the family's collective processing of the event, she had already been erased from the story. It had become a conflict between Marcus and Todd, a personality clash, a joke taken too far, and the woman who had been used as its instrument had simply ceased to be part of the conversation. He found this clarifying in a way that was painful and necessary simultaneously. There was one exception. His father called on a Wednesday evening, for days after the restaurant. His father, who called rarely and texted never and communicated love primarily through the act of showing up, called Marcus on a Wednesday evening and said he had heard some things and wanted to know how Marcus was doing. Marcus told him. He told him the whole thing, from the beginning, all the details he had not yet told anyone else in the family. His father listened without interrupting, which he always did. When Marcus finished, his father was quiet for a moment, and then he said something about dignity that Marcus has carried since, that the people who set traps for others generally believe that other people's dignity is negotiable the same way theirs is, and that the important thing was that Marcus knew his own was not on the table. Marcus said he did know that. His father said good. Then he asked if Marcus wanted to come for dinner on Sunday, and Marcus said yes. Marcus texted Denise on Monday, the same day he called Todd, and asked if she was free the following Saturday. She said she was. He chose a different restaurant, in a different neighborhood, one with no associations for either of them, a small Vietnamese place he had eaten at a few times and liked for its quietness and its quality. He arrived a few minutes early again. She arrived exactly on time again. They sat down, and the server brought water and menus, and they ordered without the slight careful hesitation of the first time, with the easier rhythm of people who have already established something. They talked about Monday. Denise had spoken to Carla at work, a conversation she described as brief and not particularly satisfying, in which Carla had been apologetic in the way of someone who wanted the apology to close the subject rather than open it. Marcus told her about the call with Todd. He said it plainly, without performing more feeling than he had. Denise listened and then said she thought he had handled it exactly right. That saying what you mean once, clearly, to the person who needs to hear it, and then not continuing to say it indefinitely, was the most honest way to handle something like that. She said there was a version of that kind of confrontation that was about justice and a version that was about punishment, and that the first was worth doing and the second generally was not. Marcus asked her how she had learned to think that way. She said her grandmother had been very clear about the difference between setting something right and making someone suffer, and that the first was occasionally necessary and the second was a waste of the one life you had. They talked about other things. They talked about the week they had each had, the ordinary details of ordinary days, and there was something unexpectedly pleasurable about that, about the shift from the charged atmosphere of the first dinner to something quieter and more daily. Marcus noticed that he was comfortable in the conversation in a way he was not always comfortable with new people, that he was not monitoring himself or calculating the impression he was making in the effortful way social interaction sometimes required him to do. Denise seemed equally at ease. She laughed more on the second date than the first, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, that appeared when something struck her as genuinely funny rather than when politeness suggested a laugh was appropriate. Marcus found he was actively trying to produce that laugh by the second hour of the evening, and that this was something he had not consciously tried to do with anyone in a long time. When they left the restaurant that second night, they stood on the sidewalk for a while longer than they had the first time, talking about nothing specific, about everything available. The way people stand outside when neither of them quite wants the conversation to end, but neither wants to be the one to say so directly. Eventually Denise said she had an early morning and Marcus said he did too, and they said goodnight. He walked to his car and sat in it for a moment before starting the engine, aware of a feeling he had not felt in a while. Something open and light in his chest, something that was carefully, quietly beginning to hope. There is a detail from that Saturday night that Marcus found out about later, about 3 weeks after the restaurant, through a mutual connection who had seen something on social media and brought it to Marcus's attention, not to stir anything, but because they thought he should know. Todd had posted a short clip on his social media account. It was footage from that evening, shot from the booth across the restaurant. A few seconds of Marcus and Denise at their table, talking, laughing at something. The caption Todd had written was something along the lines of, "That moment when the setup actually works out LOL." The comments below it were from friends of Todd's who had not been there, making light, joking remarks, a few heart emojis, the usual casual affirmation of a social media post. It had a few dozen interactions, and then sank below the surface of the feed the way those things do. Marcus read about the post, and then sat with it for a while. What he felt, examining his reaction carefully, was something he had not expected. Not anger, not at first, but something closer to astonishment. Because the clip Todd had posted, and the caption he had written for it, and the way his friends had responded, none of it reflected what had actually happened that evening from Todd's perspective. Todd had gone to that restaurant to film a humiliation and had come home with footage of two people having a good time. And his response had been to reframe the footage as evidence that the evening had gone according to plan, that the setup had worked out, that what you were seeing in that clip was what he had intended to produce. He had taken the failure of his own plan and restructured it as success in the retelling, and posted it publicly, and accepted the resulting affirmation from people who did not know any better. It was such a complete and effortless act of revisionism that Marcus found it almost philosophically interesting. The capacity to look at an evening that had gone nothing like you intended and simply decide, in the telling, that it had gone exactly as you planned. Marcus did not respond to the post publicly. He did not ask Todd to take it down. He mentioned it to Denise, who said she had seen it. A friend had sent it to her, and that she had found it more interesting than upsetting, for largely the same reasons Marcus had. She said it told you something important about someone when they would rather claim credit for an outcome they did not produce than acknowledge that the outcome was someone else's. Marcus agreed. They did not spend long on it. There were more interesting things to talk about. The months following the restaurant dinner brought with them a gradual but meaningful rearrangement in Marcus's relationship with his extended family. Not a dramatic rupture. No public confrontations, no declared sides, no events that would be obvious to an outside observer. Just a quiet, deliberate adjustment in where Marcus put his time and attention and emotional availability. He stopped going to the larger family gatherings where Todd and Renee would be present and where the unspoken expectation was that he would perform normalcy for everyone's collective comfort. He declined invitations politely and without lengthy explanation. He responded to calls from relatives who were working the phones of family diplomacy with patience and brevity, and then redirected his energy. What he was discovering, in this process, was that a significant number of the relationships in his extended family had been maintained primarily by his own willingness to accommodate, to show up, to be present, to absorb whatever came and not require much in return. He had done this automatically for years, out of a combination of loyalty and habit, and the particular guilt that comes from being the person everyone considers steady, because steady people feel somehow obligated to keep being steady regardless of what is being asked of them. The restaurant had cracked something open in that pattern. He had seen, very clearly, how some of the people who were supposed to know and care for him actually saw him, and having seen it, he could not quite return to the previous position of comfortable not knowing. He became more selective. He spent more time with his parents, particularly his father, with whom the Sunday dinners had become a genuine ritual that both of them valued and protected. He spent more time with a small number of friends outside the family, people who had known him long enough to know him well and who had nothing invested in the politics of the extended family dynamic. He put energy into his work and into the deliberate building of the kind of life that reflected what he actually valued, rather than what the family narrative about him suggested he should value. None of this was dramatic. All of it was real. While all of this was unfolding in Marcus's world, Denise was navigating her own aftermath of that Saturday evening, quieter in some ways, more complicated in others. Her primary workplace discomfort was the ongoing daily proximity to Carla, who had connected her to the setup and whose apology had been insufficient without being hostile, leaving them in an awkward middle ground where neither acknowledgement nor resolution had fully occurred. Denise handled this the way she handled most interpersonal friction at work, with professional courtesy and minimal personal engagement. She was not punishing Carla. She was simply being accurate about what they were to each other, which was colleagues rather than friends, and behaving accordingly. Carla seemed to have decided that this was acceptable, or had decided to treat it as acceptable, and after a few weeks the dynamic settled into something that was functional, if not warm. More significantly, the experience had confirmed something in Denise that she had been thinking about for a while, about the quality of connection she was building in her life, and whether the people she was allowing into her orbit were people who actually saw her clearly. This was not a new concern. She had been aware for some time that she had a tendency to stay in the periphery of social groups rather than at the center of them, partly by temperament and partly because she had learned from experience that being at the center required a kind of performance she was not interested in sustaining. She had a small number of genuinely close friendships, women she had known for years and trusted completely, and she had a larger number of acquaintances and work connections that occupied a different tier. The question was whether she was building the first category with enough intention, or whether she was defaulting to the second because it required less of her. She started being more deliberate about this. She made plans with the friends she was genuinely close to more consistently, rather than letting those relationships run on goodwill and inertia. She was more honest with herself about which social obligations were genuinely meaningful and which ones she was attending out of habit or politeness. She turned down invitations that she had previously accepted automatically, and used the time for things that were more aligned with what she actually wanted her life to be. She would say later, building inward, toward the center of herself and the things and people that were actually real there, rather than outward toward whatever was available and convenient. The restaurant had been a strange and specific catalyst for this process, but the process itself was something she had been ready for. The Sunday dinners with his father became one of the anchors of Marcus's year following the restaurant. They were not complicated events. Marcus would drive to his parents' house. His mother would be there and would feed them all and ask questions and fill the room with her particular brand of loving, anxious energy. And then his mother would move into the other room to watch something on television, and Marcus and his father would sit at the kitchen table with coffee and talk. His father had a way of asking questions that were not quite questions. Observations framed gently that created space for Marcus to say something true without feeling interrogated. He would say things like, "Sounds like you've been thinking about what family actually means to a person," and then wait, and Marcus would find himself talking about things he had not consciously known he needed to say. In one of these conversations, several months after the restaurant, Marcus told his father about Denise, about who she was and how she had handled that night and what had happened since. His father listened all the way through and then asked a few specific questions about her background, about what she was working toward, about what Marcus saw in her when he talked with her. Marcus answered all of it, and then his father was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was thinking rather than when he was finished. Then he said that the test of what a person is made of is most visible in what they do under pressure, and that from what Marcus was describing, Denise had shown him something very clear about what she was made of on a night that had tried to put her under a particular kind of pressure. Marcus said yes. His father said that was worth paying attention to. Marcus said he was. His father said good, and reached for his coffee cup, and that was the whole conversation. But Marcus left that evening with something settled in him that had not quite been settled before. There is something worth examining carefully in the logic of what Todd and Renee constructed that Saturday. Something that goes beyond their specific actions and speaks to a broader pattern that is more common than most people would admit. The decision to humiliate someone through a staged social situation involves a specific chain of reasoning, and each link in that chain reveals something about the people who built it. First, it requires that you have identified a person as appropriately targetable, that you have looked at someone and decided they can be aimed at without consequence, because something about their position or their personality or the way they are perceived makes the aiming acceptable. Second, it requires that you have a theory about what will wound them, a specific vulnerability you have identified or assumed and around which you have designed a situation. Third, it requires collaborators, people willing to participate, to show up, to hold the phone, to watch. And fourth, it requires the absence of a certain kind of imagination, the inability or unwillingness to fully consider the experience of the person being targeted from inside their own perspective. Todd and Renee had all four of these elements. They had identified Marcus as someone whose quietness and seriousness and recent single status made him suitable to be aimed at. They had a theory about what would wound him, specifically the presence of a woman they believed he would find embarrassing in a public context where his embarrassment would be visible. They had collaborators, their two friends in the booth, and Carla as the access point to Denise. And they clearly lacked the imagination to genuinely consider what the evening would feel like from inside the experience of either Marcus or Denise. If they had possessed that imagination, if they had been able to fully occupy either of those perspectives even briefly, the plan would almost certainly have dissolved before it reached execution. Because from the inside of Marcus's or Denise's experience, there was nothing funny happening. There was just a specific kind of cruelty wearing a costume. What is also worth noting is that the plan failed entirely on its own terms, and that the failure was produced by exactly the qualities that the planners had underestimated. Todd and Renee's theory of Marcus included his quietness as a weakness, the assumption that someone who did not perform confidence loudly would be rattled by social exposure. They had missed that Marcus's quietness was not the absence of strength, but the form his strength took. And their decision to use Denise as an instrument had assumed that she was someone who could be used without complication, that she would not see, or that if she saw, she would not have the resources to respond. They had missed everything that was actually true about Denise. And so their plan, built on a set of assumptions that were wrong, encountered two real people who were nothing like those assumptions, and it collapsed quietly in a booth near the restaurant wall, while two strangers across the room talked about books and travel and grandmothers and the specific satisfaction of a project that comes in on time. 6 months after the restaurant, Marcus and Denise had been seeing each other consistently, every week or two, sometimes more, building something that was real without either of them rushing to name it or frame it before it was ready to be named or framed. Marcus has said that one of the things he appreciated most about Denise was her total absence of urgency about the relationship, not absence of care, which was visible and genuine, but absence of the pressure that sometimes attaches to romantic connection, the need to label things and establish timelines and perform milestones. She seemed content to let it be what it was, to add to it gradually and honestly, and this created a pace that felt right to Marcus in a way he had not experienced before. He had told his mother about Denise by this point, a conversation that had gone better than he expected, partly because his mother, whatever her other anxieties, was genuinely invested in his happiness and could hear in the way he talked about Denise that this was something real. His mother asked the questions mothers ask about her background, her work, her family, where she grew up, and Marcus answered them and then said, at some point, that the more important thing was that she was someone who had shown him something important about herself in a difficult moment and had turned out to be exactly who that showing suggested she was. His mother said that was a good way to know someone. Marcus agreed. He had not told his mother the full details of how they had met, the setup, the booth, the planned humiliation. He had told her there was a family connection to the setup and that it had been awkward, and had left it at that. His mother had not pressed, either because she sensed he had said what he wanted to say, or because she was aware, on some level, that pressing might lead to territory involving her nephew Todd that she did not yet know how to navigate. The full story existed between Marcus and the small number of people he trusted completely with it. His father, a couple of close friends, and eventually Denise's close friends, who heard it from her and who had very specific feelings about Todd and Renee that they expressed with considerable color. Denise, in the months following the restaurant, had her own process of reflection that was separate from and parallel to Marcus's. She thought about the evening frequently, not with distress, but with the analytical attention she brought to things that she found instructive. She had been in situations before where she was underestimated, where someone had looked at her and seen something smaller or simpler than what was actually there, and she had a practiced response to those situations that had served her well. But this had been different in a specific way. This had been a situation designed in advance, constructed with intention, requiring coordination and planning and the cooperation of multiple people. That level of deliberateness was something she had not encountered before in quite this form, and she thought about it carefully. What she concluded, after considerable reflection, was that the most significant thing about the evening was not what had been done, but what it had revealed. Not just about Todd and Renee, who were in some sense known quantities, people whose capacity for this kind of thing had now simply been demonstrated rather than speculated about, but about the human tendency to substitute a theory about a person for the actual person. Everyone who had participated in that setup had been operating on a theory. Todd had a theory about Marcus. Renee had a theory about what kind of woman would embarrass him. Carla had a theory about Denise, that she was someone who could be pointed at a situation without needing to fully understand it. All of those theories had been wrong, and the wrongness had not been incidental. It had been the direct result of treating people as categories rather than individuals, of looking at the outside of someone and believing you have seen the inside. She talked about this with Marcus during one of their dinners several months in. She was careful about how she said it, not as a moral lesson, not as something she was delivering from a superior position of clarity, but as something she was genuinely thinking through and wanted to think through with him. Marcus listened and then said that what struck him most about the same thought was the specific confidence behind it, the certainty that you have correctly understood someone well enough to build a trap for them. He said that kind of certainty always seemed to him more revealing of the person who held it than the person it was about. Denise said yes, exactly, and they sat with that for a moment, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that was already something they knew how to share. There is a cost that comes with seeing something clearly that you used to see through comfortable blur. Marcus would be the first to tell you this. The process of adjusting his relationship to his extended family, of being honest about where he was and was not willing to show up, of declining the social contract that required performing normalcy after a real thing had happened, had costs that were not always comfortable. He missed certain things. He missed the particular ease of being in a large family gathering where you did not have to work very hard at belonging, where belonging was simply assumed. He missed Todd in the way you miss a version of a person that you later understand was always partly constructed, not quite the person themselves, but the relationship you believed you had with them. That kind of missing is complicated because part of what you are mourning has never fully existed, and the grief for it is real anyway. He also carried, through this period, the particular weight of being the person who had seen something and said so. In family systems, the person who names a thing that everyone else has agreed not to name absorbs a specific kind of pressure, not always hostility, sometimes something more exhausting than hostility, which is the collective desire for you to take it back, to agree that you were mistaken or too sensitive, or that the thing you saw was not quite the thing you saw. Marcus had not taken it back and was not going to, and sustaining that position required a kind of energy that was real and that he respected in himself without romanticizing it. It was not a heroic stance. It was just a refusal to be dishonest, which should not require heroism, but sometimes does. What helped was his father, consistently, through Sunday evenings and coffee, and the steady, unheroic presence of a man who had never once in Marcus's memory told him that something he felt was wrong or that something true was not worth saying. And what helped was Denise, who understood the cost from the inside of her own experience, who had spent her whole life in situations that asked her to accept less than she deserved and had consistently declined, and who brought to her understanding of Marcus's situation an empathy that was specific and informed rather than generic. She did not tell him his family was terrible. She did not tell him he was better off without them. She asked him real questions about what he was feeling, and she listened to the real answers, and she helped him think through the difference between what was worth fighting for and what was worth releasing. This, Marcus has said, was one of the things that made him fall in love with her. Not the dramatic things, the quality of her attention in ordinary moments. A year after the restaurant, Marcus's relationship with Todd was in a state of functional distance, the kind of distance that exists between two people who no longer have real contact, but who have not made the break explicit or public. They had not had a direct conversation since the Monday phone call. They had been in the same space twice, a cousin's graduation party and a holiday gathering, and had managed those occasions with the minimum viable civility that large family events require. Marcus had not felt anything particularly acute at either of those encounters. He had felt, mostly, the residue of something that was now far enough in the past to have lost most of its immediate heat. Not forgiven, not forgotten, but no longer burning. It had become a part of his understanding of Todd rather than an active wound. He thought sometimes about the fact that Todd had likely processed the whole thing very differently, had probably arrived, by one route or another, at a version of events in which he was not fully culpable, in which Marcus had overreacted, in which the natural forward motion of time and family obligation would eventually smooth everything back to some version of normal. Todd was, Marcus had come to understand, someone whose primary relationship with accountability was avoidance, not in a calculating way, not with premeditation, but simply because the internal machinery for sitting with having done something genuinely wrong had not been developed. He had grown up in circumstances that had not required him to develop it. He had been charming and socially successful enough that most of his missteps had been absorbed by the people around him without being named, and the few that had been named had been managed with the joke and the casual and the retroactive reframing that he had tried with Marcus, and that had not worked. Marcus did not feel contempt for Todd. He had checked himself for contempt and found it was not there, which surprised him a little. What he felt was something closer to a sad, clear recognition of who Todd was, of the limits of what their relationship had ever actually been, of the distance between the cousin he had believed he had and the one that had actually been sitting across from him all those years. That recognition was not comfortable, but it was honest, and Marcus had learned, over the course of the years since the restaurant, that he preferred honesty to comfort, even when honesty was more expensive. There is a way in which the most significant thing that happened that Saturday night had nothing to do with Todd or Renee or the booth near the wall. The most significant thing, in Marcus's telling, was what he discovered about himself in the hours and days and months that followed. The picture that emerged when the events of that evening forced him to look at certain things he had been holding at a comfortable distance. He discovered that he had been tolerating a level of dismissal from certain people in his life that he had been calling acceptance, had been calling family, had been calling the ordinary friction of close relationships. He discovered that his quietness had sometimes operated not as strength, but as accommodation, as the choice to absorb rather than to object, because objecting required more social energy than he was willing to spend, and because some part of him had believed, imprecisely, that being accommodating was the same as being forgiving. He learned that they were not the same thing. He also discovered something more hopeful. He discovered that his instinct, in a moment of unexpected exposure, to stay, to be present, to refuse to perform distress or flee to the exit, had been exactly right. Not because staying had produced a romantic outcome, though it had. Not because it had resolved the situation with Todd, which it had not. But because the decision to stay and be real, in a room designed to make him small, had confirmed something in him about his own resources. He had found out, under pressure, that he was someone who did not collapse under pressure. That was not a small thing to know about yourself. He had not known it with quite this certainty before that evening, and he knew it now in a way that felt installed, permanent, not dependent on being tested again to remain true. There is something worth sitting with in this story. Something that goes past the specific events of one Saturday evening in a mid-range Italian restaurant. It is about what people believe when they construct a humiliation for someone else. Todd and Renee, in planning that night, made a series of quiet assumptions. They assumed that Marcus's dignity could be rattled by the right combination of social exposure and the right kind of woman placed across from him. They assumed that Denise, whatever it was about her that they thought made her suitable for use as a prop, would not see through what was happening, or that if she did it would not matter. They assumed that the reaction they were going to film would be the reaction they got, that Marcus would behave the way their understanding of him predicted he would behave. Every single one of those assumptions was wrong. But the wrongness of those assumptions was not accidental and was not luck. It was the direct result of looking at two people and seeing categories rather than individuals. Todd and Renee had looked at Marcus and seen the quiet, serious cousin who could be rattled. They had looked at Denise and seen whatever they had decided she represented. A prop, an instrument, a means to an end, rather than a person with a specific history and a specific set of qualities that made her exactly the wrong choice for the role they had assigned her. If they had looked at either of them clearly, had possessed the imaginative capacity to see them as they actually were, the evening would never have happened. The plan could not have survived contact with the real people it was aimed at, which is exactly what happened. The plan met the real people and dissolved. This is also, in a broader sense, a story about what dignity actually is and where it lives. It does not live in how other people see you. It does not live in whether the situation you are placed in is fair or kind or arranged in your favor. It lives in you, in the choices you make in the moments that try to take it from you, in the refusal to accept someone else's small assessment of who you are. Marcus had that dignity and did not lose it. Denise had it and demonstrated it so clearly and so completely that the people who had tried to use her as a diminishment of someone else ended up looking diminished themselves, sitting in a booth near the wall, watching a dinner they had designed for someone else's humiliation become, in real time, something they had no part in and no claim to. Marcus and Todd have not had a real conversation since that Monday phone call. They have been at a small number of family events at the same time and have maintained the minimum viable surface-level exchange that those occasions require. An acknowledgement, the briefest possible words, a mutual unspoken understanding that neither of them is going to make a scene in front of the assembled family. The ease that used to exist between them, the shorthand of shared history and decades of proximity, is gone. Marcus does not expect it to return and has arrived, gradually and mostly, at a peace with that. Not the false peace of pretending something did not happen, but the real peace of understanding something clearly and having decided how to hold it. Renee has settled into a performance of cheerful normalcy whenever she and Marcus share a space, a brightness that is slightly too consistent, a readiness to laugh that comes a fraction of a second too fast. Marcus is polite to her, and nothing more. He does not invest energy in hostility, and he does not invest energy in pretense. He simply is what he is, in whatever room they happen to occupy together, and lets her manage the rest. Carla, at Denise's workplace, eventually left for a different position at another hospital, which resolved the daily friction of their dynamic without requiring any final conversation. Denise wished her well when she left and meant it, in the limited way you can mean well-wishing for someone whose better judgment you have lost confidence in. She has not thought much about Carla since. As for Marcus and Denise, they are still together. Marcus has been careful, in the telling of this story, not to present their relationship as the redemptive conclusion of a story about betrayal, because it is not. It is its own thing, larger and more real than its origin story, not reducible to where it began. What he says is that she is someone who taught him something important on a night when the teaching was not expected and not arranged, and therefore landed more completely than any intentional lesson could have. He says that when he thinks about what he knows about her now, about her history, her grandmother, the exact precise quality of her attention when she is listening to something real, the way her laugh arrives before she can decide whether or not to allow it. And then he thinks about the fact that the people who arranged that dinner thought they were using her to make him smaller. He finds it impossible to be only angry. He is also, underneath the anger and past it, grateful. Not to them, to her, and to the strange alchemy of circumstances that put two people across a table from each other and trusted them to make something real out of whatever they found there. He says the people who arranged that dinner did not know what they were doing. They thought they were watching him fail. They could not have understood, sitting in that booth with their phones and their expectations, that what they were actually doing was introducing him to someone who would matter to him in ways that still, even now, he is discovering. That part, Marcus says, he almost finds funny. Almost. The wound of what they thought of him is still real, still present, still something he carries in the way you carry a thing that has changed your understanding of people you once trusted without question. But over and underneath that, there is something else, the memory of a restaurant table and a woman who looked at him with clear eyes and said, in so many words, I see what is happening here, and it does not diminish either of us. Unless we let it. He chose not to let it. So did she. And the rest is still being written, one Sunday dinner, and one real conversation, and one ordinary extraordinary day at a time. If you made it to the end of this video, genuinely, thank you. Stories like Marcus and Denise's are submitted to this channel by real people who lived through real moments that changed the way they understood themselves and the people around them. And it means everything to us that we can tell those stories with the honesty and care they deserve. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something in your own life, if it made you think about dignity or family or the cost of seeing things clearly, we want to hear from you in the comments. Tell us what stayed with you. Tell us where you are watching from. Because this community reaches further than we sometimes remember, and we are grateful for every single person in it. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. We have more stories coming, stories that we believe will matter to you, and we do not want you to miss them. Take care of yourselves. We will see you in the next one.